All right, guys, good afternoon, everyone. I hope you're enjoying your lunch. Thank you for joining us today. A lot to talk about. Today we have what next? Future of the ROK-US Alliance. As you all know, President Trump, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un declared the opening of a new future for the US and North Korea after their summit in Singapore on June 12th. In their agreement, North Korea reaffirmed its commitment toward complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, all right, while the US offered security guarantees in exchange. But following the summit, Trump sent a few shockwaves around after announcing the suspension of the US-Korea joint military exercises, labeling them as provocative and tremendously expensive. This has raised new and complex questions for US allies, especially South Korea and Japan. So as Trump and Kim enter a new phase of diplomacy, so what are some of the challenges that lie ahead, and what do these mean for the future of the alliance in the region? So lucky for us, we have a stellar lineup of experts to share their take on the summit and to shed some light on these tough questions. So we have on my left is Dr. Choi Kang, Vice President for Research at the Asan Institute, who will also be moderating the panel. We also have Mr. Abe Denmark, Director of the Asia Program at the Woodrow Wilson Center, Ms. Kelsey Davenport, Director of Nonproliferation Policy at the Arms Control Association, Dr. Myong-Hyun, a Research Fellow, also a North Korea expert at the Asan Institute, and last but not least, Mr. Scott Snyder, Senior Fellow for Korea Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. So to kick off our panel, I'll now turn the mic over to Dr. Choi. Thank you.
Thank you, Eileen. But actually, you hijacked me already, so there's questions I was going to ask them, so actually. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. Maybe this is the first in this kind of event after the summit. So my first impression of the summit was a kind of disappointment. Second is a shock. So very much disappointed to see the outcome of the summit, not so much complete, not like what President Trump said, it's complete agreement, I don't think so. But anyhow, we have some time to evaluate this summit because Secretary Pompeo is going to have a meeting with his North Korean counterpart to come up with some more details. But I don't know how far he can go. It's quite kind of puzzle. We will see what will happen. But anyhow, the other second way about what about the ROK-US Alliance? Are we on the same ground or same page again, or maybe we will be seeking some different paths about the future? So on that, actually, I like some questions. First question is all about kinds of what is your overall assessment of summit? Abe?
I think my overall assessment is basically the same as yours. Just a little nuance though. I was also fairly disappointed about the. I'm getting the turn on your mic.
Yep.
Thanks for the note. As soon as you said that, I said. Sorry about that. Okay, there we go. So I share your thoughts on disappointment with the event, but I do think that it's not entirely disappointing. I think it's important to think about what happened and what didn't happen. The return of POW and MIAs remains, I think, is a good thing, and I think it's something we shouldn't overlook. But I think most importantly is that we're now in a diplomatic process. That the dialogue, the dynamic has shifted from this hyperbole, the tension, the fire and fury rhetoric, to a diplomatic process. I think that's important. It reflects somewhat that the psychology of the issue has adjusted a bit. Of course, it can go back. But obviously, what I was disappointed, what I expect you were disappointed about, was what didn't happen. There were no new commitments on denuclearization, no new assurances, but also it wasn't a disaster. My fear going in was that the president would issue some sort of ultimatum. Kim wouldn't go for it, and they'd walk out and they'd blow up, and it'd be a huge disaster. So that didn't happen. But was it worth giving Kim so much legitimacy, so much prestige, so much political capital that we're just starting to see in North Korean propaganda? I think that's I think it's very questionable whether what we got was worth what we gave. But overall, I think I was more concerned about it. I did want to, at some point, I hope we can talk about the exercises, what happens with the alliance.
Okay,
but
sure.
initially, just,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay, Kelsey?
Well, I think this summit was always going to be about optics and not substance. So I was not terribly surprised when President Trump came back to the United States and essentially declared that the North Korean nuclear threat is over. Now, of course, that's not reflected in what actually happened at the summit. I mean, the summit document was mediocre at best. It referenced complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula without providing any context for what that actually means, what the definition is, and what the next steps forward are. So for me, there are still big unanswered questions about, was the summit a success and was it a failure, or was it a failure? And if this process, if the summit manages to jumpstart a process where we actually see some clarity on denuclearization, and we see some concrete steps by North Korea to reduce the threat posed by its programs, then I think that starting with a high-profile head of state meeting may have been a risk worth taking. But ultimately, if the ambiguity over what denuclearization means results in the process falling apart, if the ambiguity jeopardizes future talks, then I think the United States handed some big concessions to North Korea and didn't get anything in return. So in my mind, the jury is still out on whether or not this meeting was a success or a failure.
Okay, Myong-Hyun?
Great, got it. So from my point of view, is actually, I'm not really talking on behalf of the entire Korean public, but I think a lot of Koreans actually share my view, which is there's a lot of expectation built up before going to the summit. I mean, there's so much repetition of the word CVID. Secretary Pompeo said it several times that that was the minimum baseline, that outcome that one should be expected out of talking to Kim Jong-un. But instead of CVID, we got, well, like a complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. So I think we should use a new acronym like CDKP. So we got CDKP instead of CVID. And so I think that the problem was that the US administration, the Trump administration, built up so much expectation going to the summit, but they under-delivered. So that's one observation. Another observation is that the National Security Advisor, John Bolton, says so many times that he would like to see the imposition of the Libyan model. So essentially, Libyan model is the one which North Korea delivers denuclearization first, and then waits for the rewards from, in terms of security guarantees and economic assistance from the US. Right now, instead of having that, we actually have the reverse of the Libyan model, in which the US will be providing security guarantees and economic assistance to North Korea. Then North Korea may denuclearize eventually. So I don't know whether, I don't know, John Bolton was there in Singapore with the president, but I don't know how his feelings was, watching the whole thing unfolding before his eyes, that it was exactly the opposite of what he had predicted. So that was disappointing. And thirdly, the listing of the issues and the final agreement was I don't know, I cannot really come up with any better term than this, was shocking. Because if you look at the list of agreements, issues in the agreement, the first issue, the agreement is about bringing the new relations between US and DPRK, followed by a peace regime, and thirdly, by the denuclearization. So denuclearization, in terms of a priority, went all the way down from the most pressing concern to the last one. So it sounds like to me that the US, Trump administration has backed off from the idea of putting denuclearization at top of the policy agenda when it comes to North Korea. Instead, it's now going to provide security guarantees first, improve the external environment for North Korea first, make sure that the North Korea feels safe, then maybe talk about denuclearization. So I think this is, in a way, a complete shift of the policy paradigm by the Trump administration, which happened overnight, pretty much. So I think we need to discuss this more in depth, definitely.
Thank you. Scott?
Yeah, I think it's kind of complicated to evaluate because I think we've got to keep in mind that one thing that the two leaders were able to do was to put us on a different trajectory from a trajectory toward confrontation to one in which a common interest was defined. I think the problem is that the definition of common interest, as we saw in the joint statement, was very limited. The meeting obviously provided an opportunity to cap the risk of military confrontation, and I think that it succeeded in enlarging the problem. Sometimes one aphorism is that if you are dealing with an intractable problem, denuclearization, maybe the right way to approach it is to enlarge it. And so now we have this connected to peace. And so then the question is, well, what do we have? The statement was very weak, but then I think that what we learned from KCNA was that actually the statement doesn't tell us much about what really happened. And so that definitely tells me that we're not on the Libyan model, we're on the North Korean model. The administration moved dramatically in the direction of what North Korea's going-in position had always been. And the question then is really whether or not we can see evidence that Kim Jong-un made a strategic decision or that he's willing to reciprocate. And I would say that the evidence is scant and that in Pompeo we trust. He's got a very heavy lift at this stage and still is making very ambitious statements. And of course the problem is that we don't know why. And so I think the fundamental challenge for people watching from the outside is that we're not getting a full picture. It's opaque in terms of what's happening. And so either it really is thin gruel or there's a missing piece that we simply haven't been able to see. And it's evident that there are missing pieces because even between the signing of the statement and Trump's press conference, we had new elements that came into the picture.
Yes. So cautiously pessimistic, cautiously optimistic. So we will see what will happen. But actually, heavy lifting done by Secretary Pompeo in coming months or two. So we will be able to judge the summit, and then we will be able to verify whether North Korea is really sincere to give up its nuclear weapons and nuclear program in a couple of months. But if you fail to have that evidence soon enough, maybe we will be in a position to criticize the joint statement again. But actually, my takeaway from this joint statement, the way the joint statement was structured, as Myong-Hyun mentioned, actually start with both United States and North Korea should start to build new relations. It's alluded that actually the confrontation nowadays we have on the Korean Peninsula is caused by the division and also hostile policy of the United States. I can imagine that North Korea can justify the possession of nuclear weapons and development of nuclear weapons as a reaction to the hostile policy of the United States vis-a-vis North Korea. Then actually it started with number one, start of building new relations between the two countries, and then peace regime, then nuclear denuclearization, and finally about the remains of POW, MIA, in the Korean War. So actually, I was really surprised the way it was structured in such a way. It's quite similar to maybe the Panmunjom Declaration, April 27th. So I can call it Panmunjom Declaration number 2. It's kind of correlating. It's an overlap between these two arguments. But compared to the Panmunjom Declaration, of course, Panmunjom Declaration is much more specific in inter-Korean exchange and cooperation in the first part. But the second and third part are very ambiguous, all about the tension reductions and the denuclearization. But compared to the Panmunjom Declaration, this declaration actually specifies the actions. No, actually, North Korea should work toward complete denuclearization, not like the Panmunjom Declaration. Panmunjom Declaration, we say each party will do whatever it is necessary for the achievement of denuclearization. But this time actually underscores North Korea's action very much specifically. So we will see what kinds of actions North Korea will do soon. Maybe they decide to close the Yongbyon facility, the Yongbyon area, or acceptance of IAEA verification team. We will see. That could be the beginning of some kinds of building trust in North Korea or sincerity of North Korea, but we'll see what will happen. So after hearing your first overall assessment, what kinds of challenges ahead of us? in realizing this? Maybe a kinds of advice to Secretary Pompeo. So if you're in a position to give some advice, what should be the U.S. position in dealing with in upcoming, probably the scheduled meeting between the Secretary Pompeo and his counterpart? Okay.
Well, I don't advise the U.S. government anymore, but I can give you kind of my sense of what the challenges are. And something that Scott mentioned about the shared objectives that we're identifying this. For the life of me, I have no idea what the shared objectives may be. My sense is that the two sides actually have very different objectives. So going in, I think the United States needs to be very careful to not chase a deal, not to chase history. Be prepared to walk. Not actually just saying, I'm going to walk, but actually be prepared to walk. The idea that that Kim Jong-un, despite decades of development of a nuclear capability, despite accelerating development of these capabilities under his control, that he would then be willing to turn around and give these up for fairly vague assurances, I think is very, very questionable. So to me, I don't think the United States has made much of a case of their theory about how this is going to work, other than fairly maximalist ideas of what they want to have happen. And the other piece is to, I guess there's two pieces to it. One, beyond that, one is to insist on reciprocal action. The decision to give up exercises unilaterally without a North Korean concession, as far as we know, puts the United States in a very difficult position. We've already given away a great amount of leverage. The United States has in the past, as many of you know, given up an exercise in 1994. We canceled Team Spirit to set the right environment for the agreed framework. But as far as we know, at least, this is something that the president decided upon on his own, potentially just in an effort to try to make the North Koreans happy, to set the right environment, but not as something for a reciprocal concession. And typically, the North Koreans will pocket these and then move on. So I think avoiding those sorts of unilateral concessions is something important. The other piece of concession that we already gave was meeting with the North Korean leader in the first place, having that meeting with the president. President Trump was not the first to get this invitation. Many presidents have gotten this invitation before. That's not unique. What's unique is that he actually accepted it without a precondition. Just said, let's meet. So they already have the legitimacy. They already have gotten rid of the exercises for the time being. So I think putting a stop to that is going to be important. The other piece that I think we're starting to deal with now, it's a traditional challenge in negotiations with North Korea, is to not allow the North Koreans to draw this out. The Secretary of State Pompeo just, I think today or yesterday, said that this is going to be a process that we'll have to make serious steps in the next 2.5 years by the end of the Trump administration's first term. But remember, the same person, Pompeo, 6 months ago, as CIA director, said that North Korea is just a handful of months away from having the ability to strike the United States with nuclear weapons. We are now a handful of months later, and now he's saying, well, we're going to make progress in 2.5 years. Those two things are not mutually compatible, unless the Trump administration is saying implicitly that they can live with, for a time, a North Korea that can strike the United States with a nuclear weapon, which is counter to what they said in the past. So their strategy, I think, is sort of internally inconsistent. If I were advising the Secretary of State, my emphasis would be on let's achieve a freeze of their nuclear missile programs, the plutonium and uranium. And the missiles. Let's get that stopped so that they can't drag this out. They're not doing testing, but they can still work on it. They can still develop weapons. They can still build stuff. Their engineers can keep working and tinkering on things. That gives them an advantage over time. That if it takes us 2.5 years to make any progress, they'll be 2.5 years further down the pike. That's something that puts the United States at an advantage. If this is going to be a long process, we need to be on equal footing in terms of time, and therefore I would focus as an initial step in what is probably going to end up being a phased process the way the North Koreans want, focus on freezing their nuclear and missile program so that we can at least be on equal footing as it comes to chronology.
Okay, actually, the point you raised about inconsistency of the U.S. policy, because overnight change actually surprised Koreans very much. South Korean response on this actually kind of split it. Conservatives are really shocked. And then I was on TV program on that day, actually. It was TV Joseon Conservative, the news station, actually. And the panelists on that program actually argued, it's time for us to be more self-reliant. We cannot trust the United States, really. Maybe somebody actually felt betrayed by the President Trump. Actually, day before summit, actually, we were expecting something better deal than we have. Maybe more specifics, like a CVID, a timeline or timetable of the denuclearization process, inclusion of missile, all sorts of good things, but actually none of them is there. So actually we are really surprised. And then actually that's one response coming from conservatives. So I belong to conservative side. So, but progressive are all welcome. It's kinds of deal. So it's a good process, and we are going to have more talks with North Korea, and then we'll be able to achieve denuclearization at the end of the day. Kinds of very rosy picture. But some of the progressives are really surprised to have such a kind of abstract, the joint agreement at Sentosa. Even the actually progressives were really surprised how the United States could change its position overnight. What kinds of magic Kim Jong-un applied to Mr. Trump is going to be a question. So maybe Kim Jong-un might have some kind of talent in persuading someone else. So I'd like to turn it over to Kelsey about, from your perspective, what's going to be some kinds of challenges ahead of us after this summit.
Well, first, I have to say I agree a lot of what Abe said, but there's two additional points I want to make in terms of looking at the challenges. And the first comes back to what I referenced in my first remarks, and that's on the question of definition and the danger of ambiguity. We've seen in the past that when the US and North Korea have sort of a verbal understanding about a definition that isn't reflected in a written document, that can wreak havoc on negotiations and an agreement. I mean, most particularly in 2012 in the so-called Leap Day deal, when North Korea agreed to a moratorium on long-range missile testing, they later launched a satellite. And North Korea said, well, according to their interpretation of the document, satellite launches were allowed. The United States had a different interpretation, and ultimately this launch resulted in the collapse of the agreement. So that's, again, why I want to reiterate this point about the importance of hammering down the details on what complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula means. I mean, North Korea has made a number of commitments to denuclearization with varying degrees of specificity, dating back to 1992. So what this term means and how it's understood is going to be important for managing expectations about the negotiations and creating a proper scope for what this process will and will not accomplish. Because if you look at how the United States and North Korea are talking about denuclearization, in the lead up to the summit, it really is very different. I mean, North Korea often references denuclearization in the context of U.S. nuclear assets in the region and wants to see the U.S. nuclear forces and U.S. forces trained on nuclear weapons to be reduced as part of any denuclearization agreement. The United States, in the CVID definition, which stands for complete, verifiable, irreversible dismantlement, is focused very solely on North Korea, on North Korea's programs. And it's looking at everything from dismantlement of the weapons themselves, to the delivery systems, to the production facilities, to the research labs, to the personnel involved. So it's a much more holistic approach. And even since the summit document was reached, we've already seen some of the dangers that come from this ambiguity. I mean, at a press conference in Seoul, when Secretary of State Pompeo was pressed on why the summit document didn't include that word verifiable, he said it was implied in complete. Now, the last time I looked up complete in the dictionary, there was no mention of verifiable. So already, I think there's some room for interpretation on what complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula means. So I would like to see that hammered out in writing in the near future, and it's something that I think Secretary Pompeo should focus on. And I don't think the U.S. has to be too concerned about the label. If we walk away with an understanding of complete denuclearization that includes a commitment for a comprehensive agreement, for a verifiable agreement, I think that's fine. The U.S. can get rid of the CVID label if they don't sacrifice the substance, if that's what North Korea objects to. But again, ensuring that verification is included, ensuring that this is comprehensive, that North Korea knows the scope of what the U.S. is looking at, I absolutely think that that is critical. A second point that I would make, and I think this is important when we think about sort of the Bolton effect on, on the Trump administration's key team, is that the United States has to be prepared to stay the course on this negotiation. It is not going to be quick. It is not going to be easy. And when we talk about actual, dismantlement of the warheads themselves, that might be, years down the road, once the security relationship has changed in a manner more favorable to the North Koreans, so that they can feel like they can actually give up these weapons. But we know President Trump to be very impulsive, to change his mind quickly. And if he doesn't see progress soon enough, I think there is a real concern that given Bolton's past statements dismissing diplomacy and calling for preventative strikes on North Korea as the only way forward, that we might see the United States return to its more hostile and belligerent approach because this idea of complete denuclearization has not been realized in the 2 years that the United States has kind of put down as the metric. So, like I said, hammer down the definition, be prepared to stay the course. And I think, like Abe said, really think about reciprocal actions, and those are the 3 areas I would focus on.
Abe, you like to?
Yeah, I thought Kelsey's, I thought your comments were right on. I just wanted to add a little bit on this definitions thing. And again, this is just my conjecture from everything I've read and seen. But having negotiated similar statements with South Korea, with Japan, with Taiwan, with China, all sorts of countries, every word in these statements is negotiated and purposeful. And so this is just my conjecture, but there's one reason why the word verified, verifiable is not in the joint statements, because North Korea wouldn't do it. And the United States went along with it. The Secretary of State may say, well, complete includes verified, but there's a reason why we say complete, verifiable, and irreversible. It's not because we say complete, verified, verified. And it's not because we're saying it twice, it's because we see them as distinct. But North Korea wouldn't go along with it. And no matter what the Secretary of State may say afterwards, no matter how we may rationalize it, it's not because we have different understandings of what the word complete is. It's because the United States wanted this to be explicitly verified, and North Korea wouldn't go along. So what were we talking about? What was the president talking about right after the summit, at the press conference and in comments later? No mention of verified. What was the word he kept talking about with Kim Jong-un? Trust. I trust him. He trusts me. Think about President Reagan. When he's meeting with Gorbachev, meeting with the Soviet Union, if he said, instead of trust but verify, he said, Gorbachev's a good guy, I trust him. Completely different from how we engage with the Soviet Union, except now we're saying Kim Jong-un, this guy who runs a horrible state in North Korea, that is responsible for the deaths of thousands, including his own people, his own relatives, the imprisonment of thousands more, who's responsible for the deaths of dozens of South Koreans. I can trust that guy. And that's because we don't have any verification. So what else we got? We got trust.
Myong-Hyun?
Yeah. I agree completely with Kelsey and Abe about the assessment that what's really lacking in this agreement is the verification component. I mean, there's no disagreement between North Korea and the United States about the complete part, but definitely there's a huge disagreement about the verification. And the whole point of United States government carrying out the maximum pressure campaign throughout last year, increasing tension in the region, was to force North Korea to accept the intrusive inspection when it comes to complete denuclearization. So in that sense, it's been an abject failure on the part of the U.S. administration in this regard, and I don't think it's going to get any better with the subsequent meetings between North Korea and the United States. And I think it's actually practical. I mean, in a way, like when I say it's a bad deal, I think it's a bad deal not just for the United States and South Korea, but also for North Korea. The reason I say this is because the whole the way the agreement has been structured has two components. There's the official part, which is the agreement with 400 words or so that everybody knows now. And the other one is the informal one that we really don't know the content of it. But but the existence of this agreement has been implied during the press conference by the President Trump himself. President Trump actually indicated that North Korean leader Kim Jong-un would engage in shutting down the missile test facility once he goes back to this country. And then President Trump also mentioned about canceling the joint military exercise that was scheduled for later this year. So if you put this and this together, what it implies is that President Trump and Kim Jong-un, they're engaged in this kind of a handshake deal, so to speak, in which North Korea, based on trust, would volunteer to take on denuclearization steps to make, to actually make the United States happy. And in exchange, the United States would engage in give security guarantees to North Korea in the form of canceling the joint military exercise and even contemplating the complete removal of the U.S. troops from the Korean Peninsula. But it has two components in this way. But the thing is that, because nobody knows about, the thing is that, these are the whole agreement, both the informal part and the formal part, is a left interpretation. There's a lot of, a prospect for both sides, either side, to walk away from this deal. And another important aspect of this is that the United States government the Trump government, administration, didn't really concede anything to North Korea this time. Verbally, U.S. administration gave North Korea what it wanted in terms of priority of resolving the issues between North Korea and the United States, such as establishing new relations and bringing the peace regime to the peninsula. But at the same time, North Korea didn't get what it wanted, which was some sort of promise by the United States to lift sanctions. So the chance is that the sanctions are going to be lifted very slowly, which is not to the benefit of North Korea. I think North Korea will be getting tired of this eventually as well. So we have potentially two very unhappy parties down the road, and there's no way we can, walk away from this. So I think my best advice would be, it's really fatalistic, but let this whole bad deal run its course, and maybe we should get back to the drawing board and then restart the process again.
Okay, Scott?
So my reaction to this discussion is that we're talking about a situation where the justification for having the meeting was to meet with the decision maker, and yet the results suggest that we didn't get the decision that we wanted, right? No strategic decision. And Pompeo's comments are most, I think, revealing in that regard. Pompeo and Trump seem to differ on this, but basically if Pompeo says that Kim Jong-un has yet to make a strategic decision or that he doesn't have evidence, then we do have a problem, because the statement, I think what we were all expecting in the end, bottom line, was a statement that reflected evidence of a strategic decision because we met with the decision maker. Mm-hmm. And yet we don't have that. And so now it's Pompeo's job to go back and get it. Mm-hmm. And it's going to be a hard job.
It's a very hard job. So, but by the way, actually, Myong-Hyun, you mentioned the possibility of the sanction or lift of sanctions. Maybe if I were North Korea, I will strongly demand the lift of sanctions, because actually sanctions is an act of war from the North Korean perspective and hostile policy. So to go into the new path of relations between the two countries, North Korea will strongly demand the lift of sanctions in advance, rather than in reciprocal way. So what would be U.S. response on that? Of course, President Trump already mentioned that he's going to keep the sanctions as it is until we have some concrete evidence of North Korea's denuclearization. So,
but I think, in a way, we can say that the sanctions has been relaxed to an extent. It's not going to be, it's not a huge, revoking of the sanctions, so to speak, but it was a relaxation of sanctions. Because if you stop imposing new sanctions measures, basically, if you stop designating new entities and individuals, so it's it's tantamount to relaxing the sanctions, because what North Korea does in order to evade sanctions is to, whenever one of their key entities is actually sanctioned, they come up with a different operation under a different name. So what what the countries have to do to prevent that from happening is to designate new entities and individuals all the time. So if the Trump administration stops taking that action, then in effect what's going on is that North Korea can just take down the operations that have already been found out to be evading sanctions, come with new names, and these new entities will be free from discriminations and free to operate whatever way they want. So in that sense, I think sanctions have been relaxed to an extent because President Trump has threatened to issue 300 new sanctions measures, but he's not doing so yet. So in that sense, I guess like the U.S. made a really important concession to North Korea. But what North Korea wants right now, most and foremost, is actually the revoking of the UN sanctions. North Korea is, I think, is running out of money right now and running out of energy. Because how lean the North Korean economy is, I don't think North Korea has much of a buffer to survive, say, like this year or until the beginning of next year without having a source of income as well as a source of energy. So I think even though North Korea is not betraying any desperation about the economic impact of the sanctions, but I think that deep down they really want this to be like removed. So I think there's a clock running for North Koreans, and I think they get more desperate as time runs out. But I think that given the mechanism of the sanctions, given the fact that it's already complex, it's tied to the progress that North Korea has to make in terms of denuclearization, it'll be really slow going. So I think that there will be like a clash between North Korean desperation and the slow running clock on lifting the sanctions. And when these two forces clash, I think possibly we'll see a major change in the ongoing situation. We think the situation will be stable until from now on until North Koreans and the United States somehow resolve their issues. But I think at the end of this process could come out much sooner than we expect.
So we have not talked about the other players' response on this case, like Russia and China. Of course, both of them actually love to see these kinds of statements and then strongly argue for the lift of sanctions and going for more dialogue engagement. So what is your hunch on that? So maybe starting with Myong-Hyun.
Oh, okay. Again. So I think, so I was talking about the potential problem that's inherent in this current process. But I think the one positive factor is that I think, it's kind of ironic to put it this way, but China is one potential stabilizing factor because, as we know, what really determining the North Koreans' choices is actually the fact that they're running out of money, running out of energy. But China is going to assist North Korea economically. They're already doing that, in an unofficial manner by relaxing the enforcement of sanctions against North Korea. So that's one way of helping North Korea, and I think that's going to give North Korea more means to somehow sustain this dialogue stage. So I guess in that sense, China, in an ironic sense, even though China is eroding the sanctions regime, at the same time, it's giving more time for this process somehow to work out. So I think it's kind of ironic aspect of this whole saga. But on the other hand, I think South Korea is a very important player too. I think we know from the reaction from the South Korean government after the summit outcome was announced that I think South Korea will be also serving the same role that China is doing for the North Koreans. That the South Koreans, with each approach to engage North Korea economically, will be able to somehow stabilize the situation for a while at least. But then it's just a temporary patch to the inherent paradox in the process. I don't think you'll be able to solve the problem for good. So that's going to be my take.
Scott?
Yeah, well, I think that we can look at the sanctions regime actually at two levels. If indeed the situation is critical for North Korea, then that's really powerful leverage to induce performance on some kind of denuclearization process. But at the same time, what you're really talking about in terms of what China and South Korea can do is more like keeping the North Koreans on life support. The question, bottom line, is going to be Kim Jong-un's aspiration. And I think that his aspiration is more than life support. And therefore, if that is the case, he's going to need a broader lifting of the sanctions regime in order to be able to get investment. And so that ends up being the critical leverage that we're depending on, frankly, in the absence of many of the other levers that we have kind of allowed to slip through our hands at the particular moment. And maybe that actually is the critical leverage. We'll have to wait and see.
What will be Russia's position? Is there anyone who can say something on Russia? Kelsey?
If I could just add, though, first
Okay,
to
sure.
build off of Scott's point a little bit, I think one of the key components of that is maintaining implementation of the sanctions that are already in place. And that's going to require considerable sanctions diplomacy from the Trump administration. I mean, just based on what North Korea has already committed to, I mean, they've taken a number of highly political actions that are significant to the United States, like stopping their ICBM tests, stopping nuclear tests, that are really low cost for them. But given the political significance that they have in the United States and in the region, I think we've already seen some slippage on sanctions enforcement since North Korea has embarked upon this crusade to come off as a more reasonable party that's actually willing to negotiate. So maintaining that sanctions pressure so we can create this condition where North Korea may feel pushed more to take steps on its nuclear program, I think is going to be critical. And in my estimation right now, there's not a lot of indication that the Trump administration is going to stay that course. And I think some of the actions they're taking on sanctions outside of the North Korea space also damage the administration's ability to continue to push for sanctions implementation. And there I'm specifically talking about the U.S. response on the nuclear deal with Iran. I mean, the United States has reimposed sanctions that key U.S. allies, Europe, China, Russia and China's partners, don't agree with, and essentially is inviting sanctions evasion and is inviting these states to look for sanctions workarounds to keep the Iran deal sustained, which they've all committed to do. So I think we're also operating in an environment now where key states are looking to bypass U.S. sanctions. And we may see the decline of U.S. sanctions as a tool of statecraft and a tool of leverage going forward. So if we want to keep the pressure on North Korea, I think the Trump administration is going to have to redouble its efforts to actually keep those measures in place and maintain some decent implementation and enforcement.
Abe, would you like to add something on the sanction issues?
Not a lot that hasn't been said. Just one piece on China. I assume we'll talk about ROK Alliance.
Yeah, sure.
The Chinese leaders, Chinese scholars, are increasingly seeing the Korean Peninsula through the lens of competition with the United States. So to my mind, I expect most Chinese see the Singapore summit as a pretty big victory for them. They got a lot of what they were looking for. The United States is, at least for now, committed to a diplomatic track, which addresses one of their main concerns about stability. And at the same time, the president has injected a great deal of turbulence into the US-ROK alliance, something that China is always looking for. So I think the Chinese are fairly happy. In terms of sanctions enforcement, there's been a lot of talk in the last few months about, has North Korea changed its approach? Has Kim Jong-un made a strategic decision when it comes to North Korea? One, I think that's wrong, but two, I think if any country has changed its approach in recent months, it's China. If you look, Xi Jinping has met with Kim Jong-un twice. He's scheduled to go to Pyongyang later. 3 meetings in a very quick succession when they haven't met at all in the previous several years since Kim Jong-un took power. I think the key point is that the Chinese, I think, are going to be more open in their engagement with North Korea, both in order to keep them on life support, but also because they see that as undermining and damaging and challenging American interests and American preferences. And it helps them in the broader geopolitical competition with the United States. So while I do not expect that China will expressly, openly violate UN sanctions, I think China is going to be increasingly less impressed, less interested in unilateral American sanctions, even to the point that risking secondary sanctions as things go bad. If the U.S.-Chinese competition intensifies, if the trade war heats up again, that will make Beijing even less interested in helping us out on North Korea. So those issues are interlinked.
Okay, it seems to me that we worked hard to have a summit, very much, but actually we haven't thought about the post-summit action plan. It seems to me that it's time for the directly concerned parties come up with a common understanding of objective and approach and tools to be used, to be applied in denuclearization of North Korea, not the Korean Peninsula. So I think that I can summarize that, but actually there is a high chance for North Korea to exploit this statement again and again, as they did in previous cases. So ambiguity and abstractness of this statement will benefit North Korea very much. That's the concern I have down the road. Now I'd like to turn back to the kinds of ROK-US alliance. Second part, when President Trump mentioned about this joint military, combined military exercise, provocative and expensive. So actually, that shocked me very much. Because for example, we are in a position in justifying or defending our combined military exercise by saying it's a kind of defensive exercise, not provocative one. But now actually, President Trump says it's provocative. So that's the first surprise. Second, he talked about only money, expensive. So it's, of course, expensive, but it's worth using that asset, that money, to maintain peace and stability on the Korean Peninsula. But he's talking about only the money matters nowadays. Well, it kinds of, it's really shocked me to hear such statement and over again. So what kinds of things you have in mind or concerns about the managing ROK-US alliance? Maybe it's time for us to think about the different mode of alliance into the future because of pressure coming from the United States. Maybe President Trump might have some concern about kinds of burden sharing issue, because actually this is the year we have to conclude the special measures agreement about who is going to pay how much. So maybe he has something related to that in his mind to press South Korea to pay more on this. So what is your take on that?
Yeah, I think for the alliance, I really see four things. You mentioned budget and posture. I thought it was pretty striking when the president just added without really anyone prompting him, saying that he would like to see Americans leave the Korean Peninsula, and they just kind of said that, which I think feeds into a lot of concerns that Korea has had for a long time about this. We all know what's happened in the past, how Korea has reacted in the past when the United States has raised the issue of withdrawing U.S. forces from Korea. The issue, of course, if you look at it, keeping U.S. forces in Korea is actually cheaper than having them home, in large part because of the SMA. Mm-hmm. And compare the SMA to a lot of other countries around the world, Korea is a very good partner, as it is now, at the current levels. So I think that's an issue in terms of burden sharing. Korea wants to do more. I think the United States would help that, but we need to make sure that doing more does not mean undermining the cohesiveness of our alliance. In terms of exercises, there's a few myths that I wanted to clear up. You mentioned that they're not provocative, that they're defensive, that they're stabilizing, they're legal. I would always say when people accuse us of having provocative exercises, I'd say, yeah, these are actually quite defensive, they're quite stabilizing. If you want provocative, I could show you provocative. This isn't provocative. And I still think these are not terribly provocative. And it also, I think, by the president calling them provocative, it raises the cost of restarting them and makes it more difficult to justify to China, to North Korea, why we're restarting them if he acknowledges that they're provocative. But there's two pieces that I wanted to mention. In terms of cost, this hasn't really come up yet in media. I think it will soon. I actually have a piece coming out on this either today or tomorrow or the next day. I don't have the numbers on how much these exercises cost, but in a Defense Department budget of something like $780 billion a year, it's not that much compared to the overall defense budget. But the key point is how much money does the United States Treasury get back if we cancel these exercises? The answer is zero. The money has already been appropriated to the Department of Defense by the Congress. That if we cancel these exercises, the money goes back to the services, goes back to the Joint Staff, and will get spent somewhere else. That's how our system works. The Department of Defense gets the money from the Congress and spends it. So I think that's a key piece on cost. It's not actually saving us a lot of money. Add to the fact that a lot of the people in the U.S. military, a lot of those people who would be getting training in the United States, in Korea, will have to get training somewhere else. Pilots, for example, need to practice dogfighting a certain amount of hours every year. If they're not getting in Korea, then they're going to have to fly somewhere else and do the training there in order to stay certified. And that going somewhere else is actually going to make it more expensive for them to do their training than if they were just staying where they are and doing the training there. So it's a much more complicated question than just let's do it or not do it. But the other thing is readiness. These exercises are important to maintain readiness. Not to say that they're inviolate. We have canceled them before. We could cancel them now without harming readiness. It would take time. These major exercises, my sense is we could go a year, maybe a little longer, without it really affecting readiness. But there's also a lot of other smaller exercises than the big ones that we know about, that are talked about a lot. There's a lot of many smaller exercises that go on more regularly that directly affect readiness. And the administration's been vague about whether or not this includes the big ones or big ones and the small ones, but that'll affect how long it takes to be ready. But I'd point you to something that happened last year. The president issued I wrote down a national security memorandum last year, instructing the Department of Defense to rebuild the U.S. military. In fact, requiring Secretary Mattis to write a report, to review and write a report about readiness. And so these are very challenging things. The United States is able to deter North Korea, reassure our allies, because our forces, as are they say in Korea, ready to fight tonight. And without these exercises, eventually that's going to start reducing it. The other piece, very quickly, I'm sorry I'm going on so long. With North Korea right now, I see that we kind of have two tracks going on in our engagement with North Korea. There's the peace track that the ROK is in the lead on. There's the denuclearization track that I thought the United States was driving on as well. And hopefully will still be. There's a danger of going out too fast on one side than the other. My expectation is that the ROK government is going to see the statement coming out of Singapore as an endorsement of the Panmunjom Declaration, and that they're going to run with it. And they're going to see the United States is with us. They want a peace track. They want a peace regime. And I expect that they're going to go fast. There's a challenge, though. If the peace track starts getting a lot more momentum than the denuclearization track, that would provide a wedge that North Korea, China can use to drive a wedge between us. And so we need to stay linked up to make sure that we're on the same page with these two tracks. And when I say linked up, I don't mean make a decision then tell our allies about it after the fact. But it means linked up at every stage of thinking about planning and executing our initiatives. Finally, and I think this is the big danger, you were talking earlier about complete verifiable. I think my sense is what my South Korean friends are concerned about is that when the United States and the DPRK say complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, I think a lot of my Korean friends are concerned that the president actually agrees with North Korea about reducing American presence, reducing American commitments, based a lot in the things that he's said as president, as candidate, and even before. Until we can come to a same page, as you said, about what we mean by denuclearization and making sure that we're public about it, that we don't equivocate about it when we actually deal with the North Koreans, that also, I think, could fundamentally undermine the strength of our alliance. If our Korean allies could question our commitment to the defense of South Korea, then that could be a cancer in our relationship that metastasizes, damages, and trust across conservatives now, but increasingly, I think, potentially progressives as well.
Scott, like this.
Well, I guess where to start? I mean, we've broken the rule of no surprises twice in 1 month. I don't know, I think that in some respects, I wanted to say that this might be the Trudeau effect, but I think it's really the Trump effect. And that is the challenge of alliance partners in dealing with a president who has very unorthodox views. We've known that his views about the alliance were unorthodox, even when he was a candidate. And there are three instruments that I think can be used in order to try to embed him in the alliance framework. The first is bureaucratic. We saw Secretary of Defense Mattis state an official position about how the alliance issues should be treated vis-a-vis North Korea a week previous in Singapore. And then subsequently, it seems to me that the Defense Department has reiterated a cautious stance on this issue. Second is from Congress, where there are going to be a lot of, I think, questions, especially about the idea of getting too far ahead on reducing deterrence. And the third is the American public, which I think is also strongly supportive of the U.S.-Korea relationship at present. But the other factor that I think is really the wild card, and I hope our Korean colleagues can give us some insight onto this, is that this is happening at the same time as a dramatic change in Korean politics, because we just had a local election yesterday in South Korea. And I think it's pretty clear that for the ruling party, they feel that the wind is at their backs. Progressives are, even if Moon wasn't consulted on the idea of pulling back on exercises, he seems to welcome it. And really, Moon has so much at stake in terms of ensuring that the U.S. and North Korea get along with each other. And so, my question is, how is South Korean politics going to evolve, and what are the implications of that going to be for the alliance relationship? Because the domestic context, I think, is ultimately a critical factor in terms of thinking about what the prospects for sustaining our security cooperation is going to be.
Myong-Hyun, can you respond back to the...
Sure, yeah, I'll be happy to do so. I was actually dying to say, come on an answer for that. So, I think about, I think not the agreement itself, but then the press conference that President Trump gave after the summit was actually a watershed moment, but in a negative sense. I think what he said at the press conference, such as, canceling the joint military exercise and possibility of removing the U.S. troops from the Korean Peninsula completely one day. These happen to be taboo subjects when it comes to discussing the U.S. Relationship with South Korea in terms of security alliance. But it's a taboo subject, sacred cow, but it doesn't really prevent anybody to talk about it. But I think the fact that President Trump brought that up in this particular context of North Korean denuclearization was the worst timing possible. Timing, place combined, and the reason is because President Trump had placed these remarks in a context in which he sounded like he was totally putting himself in North Korean shoes, and was reinterpreting the security situation that North Korea was facing from the North Korean's point of view. So in that sense, I think it was a dramatic moment, and it was a wake-up call for the South Korean, at least the conservatives. So all the South Koreans who support the alliance with the United States. I think there's no going back from this. We're still living from the repercussions of the remarks, but I think a lot of South Koreans are going to say now that, we already suspected that, we cannot really trust the United States completely. We cannot really consider the alliance with the United States as a constant, but then now it's real. It's no longer hypothetical. And then also combined with the political changes taking place in South Korea, we had a huge surge of a progressive political advance in the South Korean society. And despite everything that took place in the last 10 years with North Koreans advancing their nuclear program, there's also a huge support for reconciliation in North Korea, and they're putting aside this North Korea's nuclear program, nuclear development. So how these two things combined would unfold in the near future, I think it's going to be, could end up in two things. I think one is that there could be definitely reconfiguration of the alliance or the security architecture in East Asia. If we allow this dynamic of inter-Korean reconciliation taking root, and also there's a significant stakeholding group, political group within South Korea that supports this ongoing unification, a dialogue process in North Korea, and also doesn't really touch anything when it comes to the undermining of the alliance. I think South Korea could get much closer to the Chinese side than the American side, So this is one scenario that I see unfolding in the near future, a definite reconfiguration of the regional security architecture. So that's one danger, or like an opportunity, depending on your point of view. And another scenario is actually a little bit different. I mean, it could be, South Korea is not, it's not politically monolithic as China or North Korea is. So there could be another like a political change taking place according to the electoral cycle. I mean, thankfully, the electoral outcome was concerning the regional election, the local election, sorry. So the election that's more important for the political trend is clearly the parliamentary election and the presidential election. So we have to wait for that electoral cycle to play out. And if that electoral cycle plays out, there could be another change in the Korean politics. It could be possibly that the conservatives, by some miracle, comes back to power and tries to rebuild the alliance. But if I see like many people laughing in the audience, but like this can change dramatically in Korea, as you know. So we don't know what's going to happen in 3 years. So there's that. And then, but then the problem is, I think not just for South Korea, but also for Japan. I think the writing is on the wall. I mean, I don't think President Trump might be gone in maybe 2 or 6 years' time, but the forces that President Trump represents is actually will stay here for a while. So I think South Korea and Japan will have to make provisions to guard themselves, to somehow protect their security against this kind of variability in the American political scene. So I think that could lead to, ironically speaking, a rapprochement between Japan and South Korea down the road. So that's also a possibility. So we're talking about a very drastic divergence in the future. One is South Korea getting closer to China, but there's also the possibility of South Korea and Japan getting closer. But then what that prospect is hinged upon is actually the South Korean domestic political situation. So I think that's going to be a key factor we have to watch out for in the near future.
Kelsey, you'd like to add on that?
Maybe we'll just make one related point that builds off the U.S. military exercises question and discussion. And it relates to an actor that I think has a role that's often overlooked and neglected in our discussion of the approach towards North Korea, and that's the U.S. Congress. And I bring that up not because the U.S. Congress has a role in the negotiations, but because the U.S. Congress has a remarkable power to put up roadblocks that could prevent or complicate this process going forward. And one of those actually relates to the U.S. flexibility around the U.S. South Korean military exercises. I mean, after Trump's announcement, there's already discussion about whether or not Congress should consider legislation that boxes in the president in terms of what he can and cannot do with troops in the region. And it's not just the U.S. military exercises where we're seeing a level of engagement from Congress. It's also on this question of sanctions. Given that many of the U.S. sanctions on North Korea were imposed by Congress, Congress has written in conditions that have to be met before those sanctions can be lifted, and Congress could write in additional measures and additional standards that the president would have to meet or ensure that any negotiations meet in order for sanctions relief to be granted. So I think we neglect the role that Congress can play as either helping this process or hindering it, sort of to our peril. And I think what we're seeing from Congress right now is a great deal of frustration about not being read into the president's strategy on North Korea. They're upset that they too were taken by surprise about this announcement that the U.S. would be suspending military exercises. And I think we'll see Congress react accordingly and potentially throw up some of these barriers because they want to feel like they're consulted and because Congress is genuinely concerned about a return to tensions and the potential potential destabilizing actions in the region that they want to head off, but also because they're concerned about a weak agreement and they want to set parameters for a deal that actually does, verifiably reduce the threat posed by North Korea's nuclear program.
Okay, thank you. Before opening up the Q&A, I'd like to make 2 points. First, actually, against my expectation, President Moon Jae-in, after the Sentosa summit, actually made very cautious statement about inter-Korean relations. They're taking very slow step in approaching North Korea. I don't know what he meant by that, maybe just gradual, slow, not actually there's a full speed kinds of things. So he's taking very cautious approach on that. Second, actually, yesterday, actually, they had the National Security Council meeting. Actually, outcome of the National Security Council meeting was, like, for example, about the joint military exercise. Actually, they say, we can consider the possibility of stopping the joint military exercise as long as North Korea remain engaged in dialogue with sincerity. So actually, a little more cautious than President Trump. And then after that, actually, they mentioned the three major joint military exercises, actually the combined military exercise. Urge Freedom Guardian, Key Resolve, and Four Eagle, three. But other small things, we kept them. But actually, those three big military exercises have been so much effective in bringing North Korea to the negotiation table, from my own perspective, because actually we brought in some strategic asset and putting the more pressure on North Korea. So, but I don't know, after canceling those three major exercises, what we can do in terms of military arena in pressing North Korea to the terms we like to have with them. So that's a question I like to have. Anyhow, I like to open the floor. Okay, gentlemen, and then Chris, and then. Okay.
My name is Peter Humphrey. I'm an intelligence analyst and a former diplomat. When the bus of reporters went to the site of the nuclear test tunnel, every single window was taped shut so that they wouldn't see anything in the countryside on the way. We are absolutely insane to think that IAEA or OPCW inspectors are going to have free reign in that country. It's nuts, nuts, nuts. If we believe that this nuclear weapons program is over, the mining would have stopped sometime this month. Uranium mining, it hasn't stopped. So we got 5 other weapons of mass destruction to worry about. We got the missiles, we got chemical, we got biological, we have massive swarms of drones, nobody talks about that one, and we have prison camps. So we're trading away a weapon of mass destruction that cannot be used without guaranteeing the deaths of North Korea, and leaving in place all the other weapons of mass destruction, including one that kills over 1,000 people a month. And we're going to give security guarantees to the guy who makes sure that 1,000 people die in those camps every month. I don't get it. Help me to understand.
So, okay, that's one question. Let me collect more questions. Chris?
Thanks, Chris Nelson, Nelson Report. Another great discussion. Thank you so much. Apparently, this morning was released a quite remarkable video of Kim's excellent adventure in Singapore. And apparently it was shown to the North Korean people. I haven't seen it, but Barbara Slavin, who knows a lot about dealing with difficult regimes, said it's beyond astonishing, because what she got from it was Kim is showing the North Korean people what they're not getting, but what they will get if they make peace with the United States and with South Korea. Are we kidding ourselves? Is my friend Spencer Kim kidding us all when he says that this is now not 6 months ago and Kim is going to trade a fair amount of his weapons programs in return for economic relationships and prosperity? You know, he's arguing, and so far he's been more right than wrong about what Kim is saying. This is a different deal. And yet we're spending almost all our time, and I don't mean this as a criticism, we're spending all our time talking about what we didn't get and how we're not going to get it and how it's going to be awful when we don't get it. And from that videotape this morning, we may be missing the whole damn story. You know, Kim is showing his own people what they're going to get because of this opening. I think we need to talk more about that and less about what we didn't get, or we're liable to really be missing stuff. Having said that, I agree with all the criticisms, of course. But, you know, maybe there's something that's really changed, and we need to talk about that. And my backup to that is we also need to talk more about the Panmunjom Declaration, because if there is to be a resolution, you know, of the 10,000 artillery tubes and the 400,000 guys up above the DMZ and all the conventional threats, including chem bio, that's going to come more from President Moon, isn't it? and not Mike Pottinger and Pompeo. So those are, you know, have we had a chance yet to even think about what this videotape might really mean? And is it really possible that Kim Jong-un has decided it's really time to change? I'm in it for 40, 50 years, baby, and we're going to do it. So thank you.
Okay, gentlemen, to the file. And then Jim.
Okay, Dan Lieberman. Yeah, when I hear the surprise at President Trump's announcement of stopping the exercise, it more reminds me of the incident in the film Casablanca when the police chief expresses this great surprise that there's gambling in Rick's Casino. It's where Trump said that he was only answering what Kim had told him, that it's wise to stop the exercises. And Kim had met, of course, with the leaders of Russia, China, South Korea, quite a few times. It would seem he came into the conference with already making some agreements and suggestions from what he heard. And I wonder if when he suggested that it was only, he was only elucidating what he had already agreed to with the other people, and it really is not a surprise to any of them.
Okay. And let me collect two more questions. Jim and
Jim Prist of National Defense University. We spent a lot of time talking about the summit declaration. I'm very interested in the title of this meeting, What's Next? The Future of the Alliance. We haven't really touched on that in any great detail. So let me just ask you a question, the panel. Same question we asked Kim Dae-jung, who's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations Korea Task Force. We met at the Blue House 6 weeks after the summit, 2015, and we asked the president at that time, is there a future for the US-ROK Alliance? Same question I'd like to ask the panelists. What does it look like?
okay, fine.
Oh, got the microphone.
Takamotegi, CSIS Japan chair. Now, why was it missile engine site which Trump asked Kim Jong to dismantle? Is that because U.S. know that North Korea doesn't have any good enough engine to be able to carry nuclear warhead to this country? Thank you.
Okay, let me ask my panelists to answer the questions. So maybe Abe, because actually I was really surprised when I heard that the Ambassador Bolton mentioned about all the 5 things like missile, nuclear, chemical, biological, and human rights. But actually this time we covered only the missile. Actually, I mean the nuclear, but in complete way. So I don't know whether we will be able to get the deal like we have on the other concerns we have. So, Abe?
So to Chris's question on the video, I do think you should take a look at it. I haven't seen the whole thing. I saw parts of it. I wouldn't read too much into it in terms of reading Kim's intentions. If you look, I think, to me, the key document for now, in terms of understanding Kim Jong-un's intentions, is his New Year's address from a few months ago, in which he declares victory on his WMD programs and announces a turn towards economic development, while at the same time mass-producing nuclear warheads and ballistic missiles. This is not somebody who's saying, I want to develop my economy and I'll get rid of my nukes to do it. He's saying, I've done the nuke part, that part's done. Now I'm going to pivot and focus on the economy as a nuclear power. And my sense is what we think we're going into these negotiations, and we think we're going into denuclearization negotiations. The North Koreans think they're going into arms control negotiations. Mm-hmm. And I think that they would be willing to limit and shape their force, but as a nuclear power, and that they will end it with a nuclear capability. That's my assumption. To me, what the videos meant is look how respected and admired Kim Jong-un is in the world. The scenes on the street of people calling out to him when he walked around Singapore, the selfie with the Singaporean leader, the image of the American flag next to the North Korean flag, the image of him shaking hands with the president giving him thumbs up. There's an image of from the North Korean video. It's right before we saw the two come together in front of the flags and shake hands. They had a side view of the president before he thought I was on camera, big smile. And that's what they're showing. And of course, the highlight is going to be him saluting the North Korean general. And so the message is not, you're going to be able to stay, is not if you stick with, hey, North Korean people, we're going to all be able to stay at the presidential suite at the St. Regis. It's look at how respected North Korea is, look at how respected I am. I'm playing with the big boys, and I deserve to be the leader of your country because I brought you to this position.
Does that open up a delivery risk? I'm going to deliver the economy and these great things to you. So then you get to sort of the Lankoff prediction of rising expectations is what's going to bring this guy down if he can't manage.
So I think there's two pieces to it. One is North Korean leaders have been promising economic development since the 1950s. Right? That part isn't new. What is new, though, is that unlike in the past, North Korean people generally now, they know the deal. They know that they're far behind the rest of the world. They know that they're impoverished. They know that South Korea is more developed. They know that the rest of the world is more developed. That's not news to them. The risk of rising expectations is the result of a rising middle class, right? A rising cosmopolitan, informed group of people. That's not unique to North Korea. That's standard Marxist theory. In fact, and so I actually, as a brief aside, I once was talking about the rising expectations of a middle class to a Chinese official, and he stopped me and he said, "Are you really trying to explain all this to a Marxist?" Like, I get that, and I think the North Koreans know that too. That's why they have such a robust, horrible system of repression in place.
But actually, on that, the rising expectation, but actually, Kim Jong-un will be able to blame the United States for failing to meet the expectation of people, because actually, U.S. actually is violating the agreement, or he can justify the conditions. Now, Scott, you can add on that.
Okay. Well,
the question, Casablanca.
I was going to talk first about the moral hazard of the interaction, because that's really what happened when we decided that we were going to engage directly. There's an element of moral hazard. We know that the North Koreans are going for regime legitimacy, and that ends up implicitly sacrificing the human rights dimension of the challenge. Now, if you go down that road, Congress is there. There are going to be limits to that, but and frankly, in terms of the other dimensions of the WMD, I think we were all hoping that it would be in the Declaration in some way, and there I think was another cause for disappointment. With regard to the exercises and everybody kind of knowing that, I think that really that is more about the shock that Kang was talking about of hearing a U.S. president putting himself in North Korean shoes maybe a little bit too much for comfort, and that is, I can see how that would be quite jarring.
Okay, Myong-Hyun. Okay, Scott, go ahead.
I'll just say one other thing. I mean, on the economic development piece of this, in the end, that's actually the only hope we have that this is actually going to come off the way we'd like to see it, is that North Korea between 2000 and 2018 has become so marketized that there are already domestic internal pressures, and that actually showing pictures of Singapore is occurring because Kim Jong-un knows he has to meet a demand, right? And then everything else flows from that. And I think that's the big unanswerable question that we wanted to test in the end.
Okay, Kelsey?
I want to address two questions briefly. First, the question on missiles, and then second, to make a few points on verification. But first, on missiles, I mean, I completely agree with your point that not enough has been said about what the United States is thinking when it comes to what systems are going to be included in negotiations and what systems North Korea may be able to retain. I mean, from a threat perspective, not all North Korean missiles, should be treated equally, and I think rightly so. What we should prioritize are the ones capable of delivering nuclear weapons. And I think, drilling down on that definition is also good from the U.S. perspective for messaging discipline. I mean, in the lead up to the negotiations, we've heard Trump say different things about missiles. He talked first about only being concerned with the ICBMs that are capable of targeting the United States. Then, after meeting with Abe, I think he rightly changed course and said, no, we also need to think about short and medium range missiles. But then, a few tweets later, he was back to a focus on ICBMs. So what is it? Clarifying that is certainly critical. I mean, I think that if the United States focused on trying to, halt testing and ultimately eliminate anything from the Nodong range and higher, that would leave the region in a pretty good place from a security perspective. The second thing I would say, when it comes to the missile test sites, so that there have been 2 test sites that have been discussed recently in the news. First, I think last week, some satellite imagery analyzed by 38 North talked about dismantlement steps at a test site where North Korea had tested some of its solid-fueled canister-based missile systems. Now, if it is true that they've taken steps to dismantle that site, which is the only place where they've tested that type of system, I think that would be a very positive step because North Korea has conducted very few of these tests, and it is not clear yet that they've actually sort of mastered this technology from a solid-fueled perspective. Now, more recently, since the summit, there's been discussion on North Korea dismantling one of its larger test stands. And again, I think there's some concern that this falls into the category of a visible step that North Korea is willing to take that's highly politically significant to the United States because it's one of these larger ICBM test areas, but really doesn't cost North Korea that much. I mean, coming back again to what North Korea said in January 2018, that their arsenal is complete. Kim Jong-un may not feel like he has to continue testing the ICBMs. I mean, of course, for the perspective of most other states, they wouldn't feel confident in a system after so few tests. But North Korea operates by a very different model when it comes to missile testing. He may think he's done. So again, I think we should be careful to read too much into that step being a concession. Finally, on the verification question, I'm glad you brought up, is the IAEA enough? Because we've talked a lot about a verifiable agreement, but not much about what verification looks like. And I think getting the verification right is going to be key. And the verification is going to exceed the size and scope of any verification regime we've seen before. There is no good model on verification. It's going to require us to look, not only at past nonproliferation agreements, but also what's been done in the arms control field. For instance, there are some very good precedents on verifying cessation of missile production and missile dismantlement in the New START agreement with Russia. Also some good precedent in the INF treaty with Russia. We have to look at that. On the nuclear side, I think the IAEA is a very good start on the actual fuel cycle, on the fuel cycle side. And I think, if we can get a good definition of denuclearization, if we can, get a firmer moratorium halting missile and nuclear testing and maybe fissile material production, the next step should be getting North Korea to put together a declaration for the IAEA so we can actually get a sense of the size and scope of the program. But even that isn't going to be enough because when we talk about warhead dismantlement, there's the concern, how do you dismantle warheads in a way that's both verifiable but also doesn't transfer knowledge about weapons design to non-nuclear weapon states under the NPT, because you don't want to inadvertently put them in violation of their NPT commitments. What does that process look like? Do we have confidence in it? Again, a lot of this is unprecedented. So I think, taking this time, here in the United States, but also working with partners to nail out what some of these verification measures could look like and how much verification we think we need to be confident in the steps North Korea has taken is going to be critical. Because certainly there's a technical component to verification, but ultimately, it's a political judgment when you think about how much we're willing to accept and where the risk is.
Okay, Myong-Hyun?
Yeah, so I'd like to address the human rights concern about the ongoing denuclearization negotiations. It's true, I think Kim Jong-un wants to use the denuclearization process as a leverage to make North Korea look normal or make himself look normal. And I think that's a part of the reason why he went to Singapore and gave this surprise tour of the night market and the city tour and took the selfie. I mean, the overall effect of that is that Kim Jong-un comes across as somebody normal, not a tyrant or somebody who kills his own uncle and his own half brother. So in that sense, he has succeeded in many ways. So, but then at the same time, the question is, if North Korea concedes on the denuclearization front, would make North Korea acceptable to the community of nations? My answer is no. And in a way, I think North Korea missed a chance to rejoin the community of nations. Actually, back in 2013, when the UN report on the human rights situation in North Korea came out. I mean, it's actually the categorical conclusion that report reached, which is the crimes, human rights violations that had taken place in North Korea amounts to crimes against the mankind, crimes against humanity. So I think it will be difficult for North Korea to walk back from these charges. I mean, you can denuclearize, you can actually reach a denuclearization agreement with the United States because that's a political agreement. And if you get rid of your nukes, then technically you are actually free now, right? But with the human rights violation, that's not possible. You need to, punish the perpetrators, redress, bring justice to the victim, the perpetrators, and compensate the victims, and then, investigate thoroughly what happened. I don't think the North Korean regime is qualified to do so. So I think that's the reason why I am I'm not pessimistic, but I'm quite skeptical that North Korea will ever be able to be seen as a normal country. And that's going to really influence North Korea's trajectory in the near future. I think North Korea has surprised the world by taking very daring moves when it comes to denuclearization, by coming out with this diplomatic offensive. But I think it's going to run out of course soon because they face this inherent limitation on the human rights ground. And also it's connected to Chris' argument that North Korea might be actually angling for economic development by giving up its nuclear capability. Because I think if we look at North Korea in an isolated manner, in isolation, then that's possible. In many ways. But then I think we should take into account the fact that North Korea we won't be able to do so because if North Korea really wanted to somehow monetize nuclear capability and give the riches to the people in North Korea, I would say that I think that's just not feasible in the current framework because North Korea, in that sense, will have to somehow, provide freedom or choice to the people of North Korea. We're talking about a type of economic development where people will be able to exercise their own choices. Wouldn't that go against the nature of the totalitarian regime or the regime that Kim Jong is head of? So that's going to be a big dilemma for the North Korean regime. And that's the reason why we shouldn't really come up with an external solution to the North Korean dilemma that we are seeing inside the country. I think North Koreans themselves have to solve their internal dilemma first. Then we can judge whether North Koreans are sincere about their ultimate denuclearization or ultimate goal of achieving economic development for the entire people of North Korea.
About Jim's question about the future of alliance, I think that's maybe majority of South Koreans are very much supportive toward the continuation of the alliance, even after the solution of North Korean nuclear problems, for two reasons. One, South Korea has become much more concerned with the rise of China and assertiveness of China, very much concerned with it. Of course, officially we have not said anything about the critical toward China, but we have become much more concerned with China's rise, very much, in various ways, diplomatic, economic, and it's even military way. Constantly, China has violated CADIs, and then there's a problem. The military, we have become much concerned with. Second, if you are weakening the ROK-US alliance, that actually will empower Japan-US alliance. Actually, South Korea has always compete against Japan, who is the champion of this cornerstone of stability in the region. Actually, that's kind of ironic, but actually, it's a reality.
That tracks with Kim John's answer.
Actually, it is time for us to think about the future of our alliance very much, because if we are able to complete the denuclearization, maybe under that path, it's not possible to have the same model, same alliance type we have today. We have to think about the future of the alliance, different one. So I was involved in the ROK-US alliance future model 1994, 1996. For 2 years, we came up with 6 models. So maybe it's time for us to look back those reports we made in early 1994, 1996. Maybe we will be in a position to come up with some joint vision and a roadmap for new alliance. But actually, frankly speaking, I always argue for the region, actually alliance for region and global affairs. But in South Korean public, we are South Korea very reluctant to support for the regional alliance, expansion of the alliance beyond the region. But sometimes it's easy to agree on the global affairs. But on regional affairs, some reservation coming from every corner in South Korea. But I'm very much optimistic about the redefinition or reconfiguration of alliance. But actually, we should not forget the basic spirit or foundation of alliance. But I have a concern. Actually, alliance used to be challenged from usually South Korean side. But nowadays, alliance is challenged from the US side as well. So you should do your homework in strengthening the alliance background in Washington as also in the United States very much. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. And so please join me in thanking all the panelists for the excellent presentation.